what we're going to talk about tonight is the equipment you're going to need. There's a lot of beekeeping equipment out there. You know, stuff that you absolutely need to start, and there's other pieces of equipment that are fairly optional. It depends what you're going to do with your bees. We're going to cover just what you need to get started today. So, and as we go through that equipment, I'll bring each piece out and we'll talk about it and what its importance is and how you use it. Before we do that, I'm going to talk a little bit about siting your apiary. For those of you beginning, you're going to pick a spot to keep your bees. Now, what we generally want to do is we want to face those hives southeast to south, the entrance, so the bees get the morning sun. We want to keep them not on a hilltop where they're going to be exposed to a lot of wind. We don't want to keep them at the bottom of a valley where the cold lingers down there, or maybe it's very moist down there. We want to keep them out of wet areas. It's okay, you know, they're in the rain, it rains around the hive, that's fine, but we don't want them always sitting in a wet area. So find a spot that's somewhere in between, maybe something that's got a slight wind block. I'm in Pennsylvania, we have very cold winters. We're currently sitting on 20 inches of snow where I am. So you need to make sure that you pick the proper location for your bees that they can live throughout the season. It's probably not as important if you're in Florida, but when you're other places, it's you know, up north or further north you go, location is a lot more important. Okay, we're going to go to the equipment now. Oh, one other thing I want to touch on. I got a question, I think the first week, about what to do about bears. Some of you, since you're watching this from around the country, some of you, this is not an issue. I have a lot of bears in my area. I cannot keep bees without a fence. And the only fence that keeps bears out is an electric fence. They're not hard to set up. There's a lot of information on the internet on how to set up an electric fence. I will probably put something together, get it on the Man Lake website so you can refer to it at another time if you like. So with that in mind, you know, if you have bears in your area and you have questions, watch for that, or you can email me at Man Lake and I'll get you answers on it. I can send you a document on that. So we're going to jump into the equipment. Again, this is what we need to get started with our bees. Next week, we're going to talk about the bees themselves, but it's important to have your equipment in place prior to getting your bees. So the first piece of equipment we want is what's called a hive stand. A hive stand is exactly what the name suggests. We're going to set our hive on this. And typically we want to put this on something else, maybe on cinder blocks or 4x4s. We don't want this directly on the ground. We want to keep our hive, probably 6 inches to a foot off of the ground. That way, you know, you don't have the problem with the moisture going right up into the colony. So hive stand is the first piece of equipment we use. The second piece we're going to use is the bottom board. The bottom board is what I call the foundation of the hive. It's where everything is going to sit on top of this. It's where the bees are going to come and go from the colony. They're going to enter in here, through here, and go up into the colony. This is a solid bottom board. There are bottom boards that have a screen on them. I use all solid bottom boards. I used to use screened. I don't anymore. There was a time when they thought it helped with the mites, you know, dropping off the bees and for ventilation. Again, I'm in a cold climate. I don't need that extra ventilation when it's hot. I can prop up the lid, but maybe if you're somewhere down south where it's very hot, you may want to consider a screen bottom board. It's optional. They both work. It does not matter. On top of the bottom board, we are going to put what's called a brood box. Now, I'm going to talk about boxes because we have several sizes. This is a 9 5/8 box, and we call this a deep. There's another box I'm going to talk about in a minute. It's a medium. It's 6 5/8. We call this a brood box, but it doesn't have to be. What we call a box doesn't have anything to do with the size. It has to do with what we're using that box for. So if I were going to use this for my brood, I'm using a deep. This would be called a brood box. Now it depends again where you are in the country. I will tell you, like I said the other weeks, it's important to join a club or an organization near you so you can find out what you need to do. For instance, the brood box is where the queen lives. It's where all the brood is raised. It's where they store the pollen and they store the nectar and the honey to feed the bees themselves. This configuration, for me in northern Pennsylvania, I need 2 of these deep boxes here to get through winter, because the bees have to store, in my area, 60 to 100 pounds of honey for them to survive the winter. So 2 boxes is what I need for that. Now, if I were down, say, down in Florida, where they don't really have a winter, they can overwinter, or they can raise their bees in 1 deep box. So a brood box where the queen lives, where they raise their brood, where the pollen is stored, where the nectar to feed the bees is stored, where honey is stored to get them through winter. That's a brood box. In this brood box, we have frames, just like we have in the honey super. I'm going to bring the honey super over. This is a honey super. You can see this is a lot shorter than the brood box. Now I'm calling it a honey super. This could serve as a brood box. The thing you have to determine when you're deciding what size boxes to buy is weight, for one. These boxes, this deep box, if it's full of honey, can weigh upwards of 80 pounds. That's a lot of weight to move around. So if you don't want to lift weight, you know, when you're working your bees, if you don't want to strain trying to do this, I suggest going with medium boxes. So I said I need 2 of these to get me through winter in Pennsylvania, 2 of these deep boxes. If I did not want to use deeps, I could set a brood configuration up with 3 of these medium boxes. It's not the size of the box, it's how much honey it can hold. So 3 of these mediums would be equivalent to 2 of those deep boxes. So just think of it that way. And I recommend, a lot of people coming into bees are maybe people approaching retirement, or some younger people that maybe are super strong and can't lift this heavy box. I suggest thinking about going with all medium boxes to run your bee colonies in. It doesn't matter. Again, go to your bee clubs, talk to them, ask them what they use in your local area, because it differs around the country. So for now, we're gonna say that I'm using a deep box for my brood nest and a medium box for my honey super. I always recommend mediums for my honey supers, never deep. They're just too heavy. This one will weigh, when this one's full of honey, this one could weigh close to 50 pounds. So always run mediums, don't go deeps. Now in our boxes, before I go any further, we have frames in here. This box has 8 frames. We call this an 8-frame setup. There's a wider box that has 2 more frames. It's a 10-frame box. Again, what is the difference? Well, obviously 2 frames, 2 more frames in here, but it adds to the weight. So if you're doing this for a hobby, for pleasure, I suggest you really think about 8-frame boxes. If you're doing this, you want to build a honey business. You want to end up maybe with 30, 40, 50 colonies. You want to sell a lot of honey, then you might want to consider the 10-frame. 8 frames, bees will overwinter. They'll live fine in an 8-frame just as they will in a 10-frame. No difference for the bees. It's all about the weight and what we want to lift as beekeepers. Inside these boxes, we have what are called frames. This is where the bees are going to draw out the comb. They'll take this foundation, we call this foundation. They'll draw the comb out, build wax cells out here, and that's where the queen will lay her eggs in those cells. They'll raise the brood. They'll store pollen in the cells. And they'll store honey on the side here for them to live. There are several different types of frames. We've got the one I showed you just now, wooden frame, plastic foundation, coated with beeswax. There's also a fully 100% plastic frame. And then there's a wood frame with sheets of beeswax that you have to install. You have to assemble the frame, put the beeswax in, and wire the beeswax. The beeswax is very fragile. It'll break easily until the bees really get it built out. And it's a lot of work. I say if you are only gonna have 1 or 2 hives and you really want to go super natural, you can buy wax foundation and put them together and wire them, it's fine. But this works just as fine as well. I say it's all about efficiency. If you are gonna, like I said, run 10, 20, 30 colonies, you may really want to think about whether you want to use wax foundation or plastic foundation like this. I had used some wax foundation years ago when I first started. I don't anymore because it's just too time consuming to put them together. They're too fragile. I use plastic wooden frames with plastic foundation and they work great. So we're talking about this configuration here, our brood nest, brood box, and then our honey super. We want to keep our honey super for exactly what the name says, honey and honey only. We don't want brood in here. So how do we keep the queen out? Another piece of equipment, because the queen, she's going to run up and down through here if we don't do anything. She'll lay eggs wherever there's open cells for her to lay. So how do we keep her out here? It's another piece of equipment called a queen excluder. Queen excluder goes on top of the colony like this. This one's a plastic one. They make them in metal. The size of the holes here allow the worker bees to pass through, but the queen is too big. She can't get through here. So when we place this on top of our brood box, below our first honey super, we've kind of got, you know, it closed off so she can't get through, but the worker bees can get up through and they'll draw out this comb and they'll store honey up in here. That way when we go to pull this honey super off at the end of our honey flow, there's no brood, it's all nice clean honey, no problems, because we don't want brood in our honey. Now, you'll as you talk to other beekeepers, you'll get beekeepers that tell you, I never use queen excluders, or you shouldn't use them, they're honey, they call them honey excluders. There are pluses and minuses to queen excluders. I recommend as a brand new beekeeper that you use a queen excluder. As you get to be a better beekeeper and you know the biology of your bees and you know the timing of your honey flow and how the biology works of bees, an egg to an emerging bee, you can time it so you can maybe start out with a queen excluder. When the flow comes on, you take it off so the bees have full access to your honey supers. So queen excluder, start with one. As you get to be a better beekeeper and understand more, you can maybe not use one or use one for the first few weeks of the flow, then take it off. I talked about how many of these boxes you need for the brood nest. Depends where you live. You may need up in the northern hemisphere here, northern part of the country, you might need two of these deeps for your brood nest or 3 mediums. Or you might get away with 1 deep or 2 mediums. That's, like I said, depends on where you are in the country. Now a honey super, I can't tell you how many you need. That depends on a lot of things. Depends on the strength of your colony. Depends on the weather conditions that year. It depends on the honey flow, the resources the bees have access to. I have colonies that one year I only needed 1 or 2 of these honey supers on my colony. And I had a year where I had 5 of them on one colony because the flow was so good, the hive was so good. So this is one of those variables that you can't tell people, oh, you need 1, you need 2. It's one of those things that as you go along, you'll figure it out. One thing I do want to mention that is really important. As new beekeepers, one of the things you really have to understand is the nectar flow in your area. Your beekeeping is all going to be dependent on when your nectar flow occurs and how long it occurs. Everything else is planned around that nectar flow. And if you do that, you'll be a lot more successful. So again, clubs will tell you that. The guys that have been keeping bees for 10, 20, 30 years, they know the flow in your area, they'll tell you that. So this is our configuration so far. You know, brood nest, honey supers, we've got our queen excluder on there, our bottom board, and our hive stand. The next piece is our inner cover. So we put this over top of the colony, like this. It's got a hole in the center here, and it's got a notch here. That's for ventilation. Now, how do you use this? In the wintertime, you put this notch in the front, so you get a circular airflow. We always want airflow in our colony. We don't want a moisture buildup. So we always want airflow. Even though it's cold in the winter, the bees can keep themselves warm, but just remember to put that in the front. In the summertime, when we want a lot of airflow, we turn it around to the back so the notch is back here, and we get that sort of chimney effect where the air comes in the bottom, comes out the back here, get a good airflow. Because if it gets too hot in this colony, The bees have to cool it down by fanning. When they're in here cooling the colony, they're not out gathering nectar. So that's how we kind of help them a little bit by giving them airflow. Now, the bees propolize everything down. Everything will be stuck in here together. We'll have trouble getting things apart if we just use our outer cover. If we just here's what's called the telescoping cover, goes over the top. Now, if we just put that on without this, the bees would glue this down and we'd have trouble getting it off. So that's one of the reasons we use an inner cover. The other one is ventilation. So inner cover, and the last thing we put on this is our outer cover. So that's our setup right there for our colony. Brood box, honey super, queen excluder, bottom board, inner cover, outer cover. That's all we need for the hive itself. Now I'm going to talk about a few more pieces of equipment that are essential in beekeeping. I just talked about how the bees will propolize everything. When they do, everything is stuck together. Propolis is made of plant and tree resins, and it has antifungal, antimicrobial properties. So the bees will bring that in, and they'll coat everything in there, in the colonies, the frames, the boxes, where the boxes meet each other, and you can't get anything off. Now the bees will not work above the inner cover. They'll come through this top, but they won't do anything up here. So this will always come off easily. But when I go to take this off, the inner cover, I need a hive tool. This is a hive tool. There's a lot of different styles of hive tools. It doesn't matter what you pick, personal choice. But you do need a hive tool because when I come into this colony, once it's established, this lid won't come off like this. I'm gonna have to pry it off, put this hive tool under here, break that propolis seal, and take this off. Same thing with these frames. They'll be glued in there. I'm gonna have to pry them apart and lift them up, break that seal to get them out of there. That's what a hive tool does. This is one of the beekeeper's best friends, is the hive tool. The next one I'm going to talk about is probably the beekeeper's most important or best tool, and that's a smoker. Bees are not aggressive, but they are defensive. They defend the colony. The way they defend that colony is when we go into this colony, if we take the lid off, the bees will send out what's called an alarm pheromone. It comes from their nasonov gland in their abdomen. They bend their abdomen, the gland is in the back top of the abdomen, and they give off this pheromone, and it smells like ripe bananas. And that pheromone, all the other bees get that pheromone, and they all start doing it. They all get alarmed, and they all start getting defensive. What we do with a smoker is, we put our smoker fuel in here, we get this going so we have a nice cool smoke. We don't want a hot fire in here. I start a fire right at the bottom, a little piece of newspaper, then I drop my fuel in there. There's a lot of different smoker fuels out there. Burlap, twine, cotton fiber, all kinds of things. Anything, you can use about anything that burns clean, is non-toxic, and gives off a thick, cool smoke. So we'd start a little fire here, we'd fill it with whatever fuel we're using and get it puffing. And I always do this to make sure it's not too hot. So when I come to my colony and I take this, pry this lid off and I give it a few puffs, that smoke, it masks the alarm pheromone. And that's what allows us to work that hive without the bees getting really angry. So again, that's one of probably the most important tool for a beekeeper. A lot of different styles of smokers as well. This one's a 10-inch smoker. I like this because it'll burn a long time. It doesn't go out. You don't want your smoker to go out in the bee yard, and always fill it full. Even if you have one colony or two colonies, fill it full. And that way you'll never have a problem. It'll stay lit. When you're done, I take a wad of grass, I knot it up, twist it in this hole up here. It extinguishes the fire. Next time I go out, I just relight it. So, smoker, hive tool. And the last thing I want to talk about as far as equipment is a feeder. I get a lot of brand new beekeepers every year that they get their bees and they don't have drawn comb. Drawn comb is one of those things that is a nice resource to have, a lot of drawn comb for when you're starting new colonies or putting a new colony into a dead out hive. If you're dumping bees on something like this, when you first get your colony, they have no room to cluster and stay warm. They have, no place to store food, because a brand new colony with no honey or no nectar stored in here has to rely on feeding somehow, whether it be flying out to find nectar or you feeding them. If it's cold, bees don't fly. They don't fly when it's much below 55 degrees. They're not out foraging. If they're in cluster and there's no food under them in that cluster, they'll starve. I've seen a lot of brand new beekeepers, they'll put their bees in, and either they won't put a feeder on or they'll put the wrong feeder on. And their bees die. They get a cold snap for a couple of days and they all starve. When bees starve, it's not one bee at a time. Since they share all resources, the entire colony will collapse. So one of the things I recommend is getting a feeder when you get your bees, and get the correct feeder. If you're in an area where it's cold in the springtime when you get your bees, we get our package bees usually starting in the beginning of April is when they're available. So April can be a very cold month up north. This is a feeder that I really like. It replaces a frame, and if we put it in here and we fill this feeder with syrup in here, this is where the bees go down and feed. We put that in here. It's right here by our bees, because when bees are in a colony and they're clustering, they cluster at the top of this brood box, right at the top. So if we put this feeder here, they have access within a few inches of feed. They can feed when it's dark, when it's cold, when it's raining, when there's no nectar out there, they can get nectar out of here. They get sugar water. Very important. Another feeder you'll see a lot is a feeder like this, called a Boardman feeder. This feeder goes in the entrance of the colony. That's a great feeder. That's a great feeder when the temperature's warm and the bees can move. A brand new cluster in early April in cold weather, the bees will not go to this. You could have this full of feed and those bees will starve to death. So that's why I'm showing you two different options. Think about where you are. If you're in Florida, this will work fine. If you're in northern Pennsylvania or New York State or Wisconsin, you want one of these feeders if it's chilly. Once it warms up, you can switch to this. I have a lot of different feeders, that I use depending on the time of the year. I said that the bees tend to go to bees will cluster in this top area here. So if I didn't have one of these feeders, I can take one of these jars and put it right over this inner cover, because that's where they are. And they can feed that way. I would just put a box around it to protect it and then put out on the outer cover. There's a lot of different ways. Like I said, ask people. Find out what works in your area, and that's what you want to use. Because getting your bees off to a good start is very difficult if you don't have drawn comb. If you use the right equipment, you'll be fine. The last thing I'll talk about is a bee brush. A bee brush is exactly what the name suggests, brushing the bees off. When we go to look at a colony, when we're going to examine a colony, we want to see what they're doing. So we pull out a frame. This frame is going to have drawn comb. It's going to be covered with bees. And you're not going to be able to see in the cells. And maybe you're going in, you want to see if there's brood there or eggs. So you can just gently use this brush to brush the bees off of the frame. And then you can examine that, because you want to be able to look and see what's going on in that colony as it develops when you first get it. So that's a bee brush. That's pretty much it for the equipment today. Again, these are the things that you'll use to get started. There's a lot more equipment, and it depends where your beekeeping takes you. If you get into raising queens someday, which is very easy to do, you need different equipment. If you're going to make comb honey, whether it be cut comb or whether it be the Ross rounds or anything like that, another set of equipment. All kinds of tools to help you be a better beekeeper. But that's something that you'll grow into as you go along. Mite treatments and feeds. You'll want to feed your bees in the off season to keep them alive and keep them raising brood. We're going to talk about that in the next series, about how important it is to feed your bees at the right time and with the right food. Because part of being successful in this is keeping them raising brood. I talked about the nectar flow. Everybody has a nectar flow in their area, and they differ. The length of them and when they are, whether you have just a spring flow, just a summer, fall flow, or if you have both, and you manage your bees based on that. So we'll talk about that and the importance of what you need to do with your bees in the off season when you don't have a flow, because when there's no flow, those bees are not raising brood, and we want to keep them raising brood. Again, that's for the next series, the seven things to be successful in beekeeping. That was about it for today on the equipment. Next week, we're going to talk about bees, different types of bees, what your options are, what you should get as a beginner beekeeper, and we're going to talk about packages versus nukes. They both have their advantages, they both have their disadvantages, pros and cons of each one. It depends what you as a beginner beekeeper want to do, what you have access to, how much you want to spend, but we'll go through all of that. And like I said, it's easy. I hope that you're getting something out of this session. I think it's a fun hobby, and if you do it right, you'll really, really enjoy it. So again, any questions, feel free to ask on the Facebook page, or you can go to the Man Lake website and send an email in. I will answer them. Any question you have, I'll answer them. And we'll see you next week when we talk about bees. Thank you.